An hour and a half. That was how long they kept him waiting. And then, just as time seemed to stretch on endlessly, the CEO walked in and turned everything upside down. The sleek glass doors of Highland Crest Bank parted with a soft hiss, and a rush of cool, conditioned air poured out, spilling onto the sidewalk outside. The sharp, inviting aroma of freshly brewed coffee mixed with a faint polish of leather furniture inside, creating a powerful ambience, an atmosphere of calm efficiency and high-stakes business. Dorian Bennett stepped into the lobby, rolling his shoulders under his perfectly tailored blazer. He didn't feel nervous, not in the slightest. No, he had walked into enough boardrooms, signed enough deals, and built enough from the ground up to know one thing for certain. He had earned the right to be in any room he chose. The only thing he needed now was for them to see it. His meeting had been scheduled for 11 a.m. sharp. There was no reason to expect anything other than professionalism. No reason to believe this time would be any different. The lobby of the bank was a precise blend of modern luxury and old-world wealth. Mahogany desks, sleek glass partitions, and gold accents reflected the sunlight just enough to remind anyone who walked in that money was certainly no stranger here. It was a place designed to impress. At the front desk, the receptionist, a woman with a neat, pin-straight bun and a clear air of indifference, looked up as Dorian approached. Her nameplate read Melissa, and she greeted him in a tone that was polite, but curt, like it had been rehearsed 1,000 times. "Welcome to Highland Crest Bank," she said, her voice as clipped as the expression on her face. "Do you have an appointment?" "Dorian Bennett," he replied, placing his leather portfolio gently on the counter. "I have a meeting with Linda Kramer at 11. Melissa's fingers tapped the keys of her keyboard, her eyes scanning the screen for a moment. "You're on the schedule," she said, her tone still neutral. "Have a seat. She'll be with you shortly." Dorian gave a polite nod, then stepped back to the seating area. He picked a chair by the floor-to-ceiling windows where sunlight poured in, casting sharp, clean lines across the polished floors. He watched as a group of well-dressed professionals gathered near the teleconference booths, casually discussing market shifts and potential investment opportunities. It was the kind of conversation you overheard when people had earned their place, when they felt comfortable, when they belonged. His fingers drummed lightly against the top of his briefcase. 10:57 a.m. He was always early. That's how he worked. But as the minutes ticked by, he started to feel the weight of each one. 11:05, 11:15. At first, he tried to let it slide. Delays happened, especially in places like this. But after 20 minutes, his patience began to wear thin. He started watching the flow of people more closely. A man in a gray suit, maybe in his early 30s, checked in with Melissa. Less than 5 minutes later, a young banker appeared and ushered him through the frosted glass doors leading to the executive offices. Then, a woman arrived in a cream-colored blazer. No appointment, as far as Dorian could tell. Just a quick, friendly chat with Melissa before she, too, was ushered inside. And yet, Dorian's name still hadn't been called. He checked his watch again. 11:30 a.m. Something wasn't right. His fingers resumed their steady tapping against his briefcase. Around him, people moved in and out, their faces radiating the kind of confidence that only comes from knowing you belong. Smiles were exchanged, nods of familiarity, handshakes with the staff. It was the type of casual interaction that only happened when people were certain of their place. But Dorian? He was still sitting in the same chair. His appointment had been confirmed twice, and yet he watched as at least 6 other people, each arriving after him, walked through those frosted glass doors and disappeared into the executive offices. Still, he remained composed. This wasn't the first time he had encountered this. He'd dealt with the subtle barriers before, the unspoken ones that people tried to deny. The kind that wrapped themselves in polite excuses. "Oh, we didn't mean to keep you waiting," they'd say. "Must have been a scheduling mix-up, so sorry. You know how busy we get." But Dorian wasn't the type to fall for empty politeness. He stood, his expression perfectly neutral, and made his way back to the front desk. Melissa barely glanced up as he approached. The same uninterested look on her face, like he was just another part of the scenery. "Excuse me," Dorian said, his voice calm but firm, his patience beginning to fray at the edges. "Has Linda Kramer been made aware that I'm waiting?" Melissa exhaled sharply, like she had been interrupted mid-thought. Without making eye contact, she tapped at her keyboard again. "She knows," she said, as though that was all he needed to hear. "She's just finishing up with another client." Dorian waited for something, anything, that might suggest she would check again, or, at the very least, offer a new time. But she simply went back to typing, oblivious to his presence. "Do you have an estimate on when she'll be available?" he asked, his voice betraying just a hint of frustration now. Melissa barely glanced at the screen before offering a shrug. "Shouldn't be much longer," she said, without any urgency in her voice. No real acknowledgement that his time mattered at all. Dorian let out a slow, controlled breath. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. No urgency. No understanding. No sense that his time was valuable, too. Effort to check, just another brushed off. Response meant to pacify him, and then, right in front of him, he watched it happen again. A woman in a navy blue dress walked in, her designer handbag swinging at her side. She was mid-conversation on the phone, her voice carrying a light, easy tone. Melissa's posture changed instantly, her tone softened, her lips curved into something that actually resembled a real smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Lancaster," she said. Voice lighter, more polished. The woman gave a polite nod and barely had to pause before a young banker appeared at her side, ushering her toward the back offices. No waiting, no questions, no being told. Soon Dorian let out a slow breath. He had been here for almost an hour. She had been here for less than a minute. He turned back to Melissa. "So do appointments matter here? Or is it just must first come, first served?" For the first time, she looked a little uncomfortable. "I told you, sir, she'll be with you soon." There it was again, that word soon. A delay, without a deadline, a promise without commitment, a word that let people pretend they weren't doing what they were actually doing. Dorian glanced back toward the frosted glass doors. It would be easy to let it go, to sit down, wait another 30 minutes, and pretend this wasn't happening. But this wasn't just about waiting, it was about something else entirely. Dorian returned to his seat, forcing himself to stay calm. He had faced worse. He had built a company from nothing, dealt with condescending investors, been underestimated in rooms full of men who thought they knew better. But this was different. This wasn't about his business plan or numbers on a spreadsheet. This was about being ignored, about being dismissed as if he weren't even worth an update. He checked his watch. 12:05 p.m. Over an hour. He took a slow breath, looking around the lobby. Again, no one else was waiting. Every single person who had walked in after him had been attended to. LED inside, or at least acknowledged, except him. Across the room, a young teller was speaking to an older man in Kais and a golf polo. Their conversation was light, easy, casual. Dorian tilted his head, listening. "Yeah, I told her to just walk in," the older man said with a chuckle. "She doesn't even need an appointment. You know how it is." The teller laughed. "Well, for Mrs. Lancaster, we always make exceptions." Dorian's grip tightened around the handle of his briefcase. So that was how it worked. Rules for some, different rules for others. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at the polished floors. This was a test. Would he sit here quietly, accept being pushed aside, and wait for permission to be seen? Or would he make it clear that his time was just as valuable as anyone else's? He stood, not quickly, not aggressively, just decisively. He walked past the front desk, past Melissa's blank expression, and headed straight for the frosted glass doors. "Sir," Melissa started, but he didn't stop. He pushed open the door. Inside, a hallway stretched out in front of him, lined with private offices. Some doors were open, others closed, but one thing was immediately clear: Linda Kramer was not in a meeting. She was sitting at her desk typing on her laptop. Alone, she looked up, her expression shifting from surprise to irritation. In an instant, Mr. Bennet, she said, her voice clipped. You should have waited to be called. Dorian met her gaze. Evenly, I did wait. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, her lips pressing into a thin line. Please take a seat, she finally said. Dorian sat, not because she had allowed him to, but because he chose to. But something told him this conversation wasn't going to go the way she thought it would. Linda's fingers twitched slightly as she adjusted the papers on her desk, her face carefully neutral, but Dorian could see it, the slight tension in her jaw, the flicker of irritation in her eyes. I apologize for the delay, she said, forcing a smile. We've been extremely busy today. Busy? Dorian let the word sit there for a moment. He had watched at least 6 people be ushered past him like VIPs while he sat in that lobby for over an hour and a half. Were you? He asked, keeping his tone calm but firm. Because I counted a few clients who didn't have to wait at all, some without appointments. Linda's lips pressed into a thin line. Richard said, his voice smooth but laced with an edge. I assure you, Mr. Bennet, that was not intentional. There must have been some kind of miscommunication. Miscommunication, Dorian repeated, exhaling sharply through his nose. He kept his face impassive, the muscles around his jaw tight, but his expression remained unreadable. Interesting. Linda cleared her throat, eager to move on from this uncomfortable moment. She quickly flipped open a folder, scanning through the contents as if desperate to get the conversation back on track. Now, let's discuss your loan application, she said, her tone regaining that polished, slightly dismissive edge. I've had a chance to review it, and while your financials are certainly impressive, we do have strict criteria for approvals. Given the current lending climate, I'm afraid we'll need more assurances before we can proceed. Before she could finish, the door swung open with a quiet thud, and just like that, the energy in the room shifted dramatically. The hallway, which had been eerily silent only moments before, suddenly buzzed with a low hum of voices. But these weren't just any voices. They carried weight, authority. 3 men walked into the room, all sharply dressed in tailored suits, their presence unmistakable. Dorian didn't have to guess who they were. These were the ones who truly mattered at the bank, the executives, the decision-makers. The type of men whose approval could make or break careers in a place like this. At the front of the group was a face Dorian knew all too well, Richard Langford, the CEO of Highland Crest Bank. A man who, without a doubt, knew exactly who Dorian was. Richard's sharp eyes scanned the room before locking onto Dorian's, and a smile spread across his face in recognition.
Dorian,
Richard said, his voice full of warmth, as he made his way over with a firm handshake. What the hell are you doing here? Dorian stood tall, shaking Richard's hand firmly. Hey, Richard. Been a while. Richard clapped Dorian on the shoulder, his expression easy. You still running Bennet Strategies? Still growing it? Of course, Dorian replied smoothly. Still growing? Linda stared between them, clearly rattled. Her fingers tightened around the folder in front of her, and her eyes darted from Dorian to Richard, as if trying to process what was happening. Richard, however, didn't miss a beat. He turned his attention to Linda, his smile fading into a more serious expression. How long has Dorian been waiting? He asked, his voice calm, but there was an edge to it now. A long, heavy silence followed. Linda opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Dorian let the silence stretch for a moment before answering. He allowed the weight of it to settle, to linger in the air unspoken, but undeniable. An hour and a half, he said finally, his tone even, but carrying the unspoken frustration of the entire ordeal. Richard's face didn't shift dramatically. His demeanor was still composed, but Dorian could see it, the slightest tick of his jaw. An hour and a half. Richard repeated, his tone light, almost in disbelief. You had Dorian Bennet waiting for an hour and a half. Linda scrambled for an explanation. There was a scheduling issue, she stammered. Richard didn't even look at her. His eyes stayed locked on Dorian. You should have called me directly, he said, his voice steady but firm. I would have made sure you were taken care of. Dorian, ever composed, offered a small, knowing smile. Didn't think I needed to. Richard exhaled sharply, shaking his head in disbelief. He turned to Linda now, his smile completely gone. Linda, he said, his voice calm but unmistakably final. Step outside for a moment. Linda's face drained of color, her hands clenching into fists before she quickly unclenched them. With a stiff nod, she stood and exited the room, leaving without another word. The moment the door clicked shut, Richard turned back to Dorian, shaking his head again. I don't know what happened, Richard said, his voice low, but I guarantee you, it won't happen again. Dorian didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. The damage had already been done. The door had closed behind Linda, but the tension that filled the room lingered in the air. Richard let out a long, slow breath, his frustration evident. He shook his head again as he took a seat across from Dorian. The two other executives stood nearby, exchanging glances, but saying nothing. This isn't how we do things here, Richard said, his tone firm, clipped, but with a trace of genuine regret. Dorian tilted his head slightly, studying Richard's face. Seems like it is, he said, his words purposeful. Richard paused, letting the words hang in the air between them. He didn't argue. He didn't make excuses. Men like him, men who sat at the top of organizations like this one, understood when things had gone wrong. And Richard wasn't blind. He knew exactly how big of a problem this was. Dorian wasn't just any walk-in client. He had built a multi-million-dollar consulting firm from the ground up. His reputation carried weight in the business world. He knew people, powerful people, people who trusted his word. And now he had a story to tell. Richard sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers together as he fixed his gaze on Dorian. Tell me what happened, he said, his tone softening, but the command in his voice still evident. Dorian didn't sugarcoat it. He told him everything. He told Richard about the appointment, the long wait, the other people who came in after him, and went straight through. He described Melissa's dismissive attitude, Linda's indifference, and the way she tried to brush him off like he was just another obstacle in her day. Dorian knew exactly what Linda had thought of him. Just another name on a list, a faceless client to be processed and forgotten. But Richard? Richard was different. He didn't interrupt, not even once. The other two executives, standing silently, listened just as intently. Dorian laid it all out, his words sharp and precise. When he finished, a heavy silence hung in the air. Then, Richard exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable at first. I appreciate you telling me, he said, his tone surprisingly level. And I'll be honest, I'm pissed. Dorian leaned back slightly in his chair, raising an eyebrow.
Why?
Richard let out a short, almost self-deprecating laugh. Because this kind of thing? This wrecks reputations, he said, the frustration evident in his voice. We've worked way too hard to build this institution's credibility. Now, I'm stuck cleaning up a mess I didn't even know existed. He turned to one of the executives with a sharp look. Make sure Linda is off the floor immediately. We'll have a conversation later. The executive nodded curtly, stepping out of the room without a word. Richard turned back to Dorian, his face regaining some of its composure, though the anger still simmered beneath the surface. That loan application you submitted, Richard said. I assume it was solid? Dorian gave a slight tap on his briefcase. See for yourself. Richard took the folder from Dorian and flipped through it quickly. He barely made it through the first few pages before his frustration bubbled over. This shouldn't have even been a question, he muttered to himself, shaking his head. He looked up at one of the remaining executives. Fast-track this. I want an approval on my desk by the end of the day. Dorian raised an eyebrow at the speed of Richard's reaction. Just like that. Richard met his gaze squarely. You should have had it 2 hours ago. I'm fixing the mistake now. Dorian considered that for a moment. He knew this wasn't about generosity. It wasn't about righting a wrong. It was about control, damage control. Richard wasn't just fixing things out of the goodness of his heart. He was doing it because he needed to put out a fire before it spread to places he couldn't afford it to go. And Dorian understood that game better than anyone. Still, he wasn't about to let Richard off the hook that easily. I'll accept the approval, Dorian said, standing up, his tone even but pointed. But fixing this for me doesn't fix the real issue. Richard's expression didn't shift, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of understanding, perhaps even recognition. We'll be having a long conversation about that, Richard said, his voice calm but final. Dorian nodded once, grabbing his briefcase as he headed toward the door. But before he left, he made sure to meet Melissa's gaze one last time. This time, she didn't look nearly as confident as she had earlier. The summer heat pressed against Dorian's skin as he stepped outside. The bank's pristine exterior gleamed under the midday sun, its walls polished and perfect. But inside, the cracks had already started to show. This wasn't just about the loan. It wasn't even just about Linda. No, this was about something much bigger. Something that played out in 1,000 different ways, in 1,000 different places. It wasn't always loud. It wasn't always obvious. But it was always there, the subtle assumption that some people belonged in the offices while others, like him, had to wait. The quiet dismissals, the polite rejections, the barriers built so carefully that no one ever questioned them. They were always wrapped in just enough courtesy to be explained away. But not today. No, today the story ended here, in this office. Someone was going to face the consequences of that quiet, unspoken bias. And the next time Linda Kramer looked at a name on her appointment list, she'd think twice before letting that same mistake happen again. Dorian checked his phone as he walked toward his car. A new email. Loan approved. He smirked to himself, tucking the phone into his pocket. Respect isn't given, he muttered to no one in particular, his voice low but certain. It's demanded. And today? Today, he'd gotten exactly what he came for. If you've ever been in a situation like this, Dorian said aloud, though no one was around to hear him, if you've ever been made to feel like your time, your presence, your business didn't matter, speak up. Don't wait for permission. Take your seat at the table. And if they try to keep you waiting, make sure they remember why that was a mistake.